Good evening, and welcome to a special edition of Seek Speaks. I'm John Flanders, President of Special Education Equity for Kids of Connecticut. And tonight we have a great panel. As anybody is aware, there's a great deal of change going on in Washington with respect to education. Fortunately, two of our board members are at the national convention of our sister organization, COPAA, the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. And they are with Matt Cohen, a distinguished Chicago attorney, and Laura Kaloy, who is the policy specialist for COPAA. And we are going to be discussing what is going on. Before we do, a couple of things of housekeeping. First, there are a number of lawyers on your screen, but nothing that is being said is intended nor should be inferred to be legal advice. If there is time, we will look to take questions, but we recommend that you keep in mind that anything you ask can be shared around the world, so try and not share more than you wish to. Coming up on March 20th, we have our regular edition of Seek Speaks with Nathan Levinson talking about the state of special education in the country. In addition to all this, our advocacy group works very hard in Hartford to make sure that no matter what happens nationally, that things in the state of Connecticut continue to protect the rights of our children. And you can find out about what we're doing, see our testimony, read our testimony, and get updates on important needs for action on our website, seekct.com. Finally, Seek is a volunteer organization. Everything that gets done by volunteers, which does not mean we don't have expenses. So we are supported by the generosity of people who take advantage of these services, and we ask that if you enjoy this session or any of our other sessions, please feel free to go to our website and make a donation. For anybody who's missing this will be on our website, and you'll be able to watch it streaming coming up. So nobody wants to hear the rest of that, so I am going to turn it over to our distinguished panel. Take it away, guys.
Hi. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to call on Laura first to bring us up to date with what's going on in Washington, which could take more than the entire hour, but she's going to try to contain herself.
Hi, everybody. I think I was able to meet some of you at a couple of years ago. So thanks for having me back. And I do work with COPAA. I'm the federal policy advisor, and I live and work in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm not yet in California with the others, but will be tomorrow. So I'm guessing you pay attention to the news, and it's no news that you have a fellow person from Connecticut who is now the Secretary of Education. Linda McMahon was sworn in on Monday, and she swiftly turned around and wrote an email memo to all of the Department of Education staff where she said, we are going to engage in a final mission together to essentially dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. And you can read about that online if you want to Google it, and you can read the whole thing. We are also awaiting an executive order that we believe is coming tomorrow. I have a potential copy of it tonight, but I'm not sure it's the real thing. But we are expecting an executive order that will call for a plan to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. And then this week, also 12 chiefs of education from 12 red states sent a letter to Linda McMahon asking for her to do all she can in the short term and then work with Congress to give as many waivers as possible under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to free up states from the requirements of ESEA, currently known as the Every Student Succeeds Act. Why COPAA cares about this, I just want to say very clearly, we fought for some hard-won wins in that law that actually requires students with disabilities to be included in general and alternate assessments. Assessment decisions impact where students receive their placement frequently and across the country. And we want data on whether kids with disabilities can read and meet state standards along with their peers. So I just want to make that really clear. To date, we are not hearing of any specific proposals to eliminate funding for IDEA. There is still a potential for a request to block grant funding for IDEA, which would remove it from being connected to the requirements of IDEA. So we're watching that very closely. We are, however, worried about the funding for Part C and Part D of IDEA. This is a little wonky, but bear with me and I'll answer questions later if we need to talk about it further. But Part B is the big federal formula that is in the statute. It's permanently authorized in the statute, does not need to be touched by Congress again if we didn't need it to be. Part C is not permanently authorized, nor is Part D. And what you need to know about Part C, that's our funding to our states for 0 to 2-year-olds, all the early intervention and services supports for young children, infants and toddlers. And Part D is where the research and personnel preparation, funding for all kinds of TA centers on special education, including for accessible educational materials, inclusive technology, and things of that nature are funded in Part D. And so we're watching those very closely and are advocating for them. We do not want to pit Part B against Part C and D. I want to be very clear about that. Those were my notes to get us to this point. Oh, on OCR, Office for Civil Rights, they did turn on, apparently, they've reopened or continued to investigate complaints that were made prior to President Trump coming into office. So they've started that, but they have closed any investigations regarding issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, which includes LGBTQ students primarily. This is of great concern. And we also know there have been many employees fired both from OCR and throughout the Department of Education, including the Office of Special Education. And COPAA and the National Center for Youth Law this week have FOIA'd a whole bunch of information from OCR. I don't know if we have the place to put in for a link, but I'm happy to share a link with John that he can share with you. You can read the press release about this request from COPAA and Nickel, and they've asked for a meeting with OCR to talk about having more transparency in what's happening at OCR. They also made changes to their case processing manual, which we are currently examining and trying to determine how significant that will be. When Trump was in office, the last time a lawsuit had to be filed related to the case processing manual and other issues around accessibility of websites, et cetera. So with that, I am going to stop talking and let others jump in, and I'm happy to talk to you further.
Well, can we have a little discussion maybe with you going first, Laura, on why we want to preserve the Department of Education, or do we?
It's a really good question. I am going to say yes, and COPAA has already begun to advocate for that. There are several reasons why. We are willing to say that there can always be more efficiency. There can also be improvements to how monitoring and compliance is undertaken by the Office of Special Education. We also know that there have been opportunities to really bring states, further along and actually take the action they can under the compliance process and withhold funds and or take other punitive measures related to how they're meeting their IDEA requirements. Having said that, with the proposal to move all of the IDEA activities over to Health and Human Services, we do not believe this will serve students with disabilities well. We have a model at the Department of Education, career staff who are well equipped to understand how schools function, how states function, how districts function. These are important components to not just their role in overseeing that, but to also provide technical assistance and support and to conduct research and to be able to help us understand the data that is collected through Section 618 of IDEA. If this is moved over to HHS, there is a real capacity problem over there, no understanding of schools. We actually have case in point data and information on how Medicaid is mismanaged in terms of of their ability to, at HHS, to reimburse school districts for school-based services for students with disabilities and others. We don't need our schools to be in the midst of a medical model. Some have said this would be akin to us wanting to, move our school district functions over to the local clinic on the corner. The two don't speak to each other. They don't know each other well. While there's a function there related to Medicaid, we don't want functions of a district and a state to be overseen by folks that are used to an insurance and compliance system.
Matt, let me call on Matt to answer that question about what's the Department of Education done for you?
Well, I think that there are a variety of things that I've personally been involved with that the department has done that very likely would not translate well if it's moved somewhere else. And I would note in relation to what Laura said, given the patterns so far, it's very likely that if it was moved, the staff who are at Department of Ed would probably not move with the authority to HHS. So for example, I was involved with the Department of Ed in getting ADHD added to the IDEA regulations. And that's something that the Congress didn't do. That's something that the Department of Ed did. So that was a very tangible thing. The other thing I would just note that's not exactly a virtue of the Department of Ed, but it happens that Secretary Robert Kennedy, you talked about a medical model, Laura, and in a sense, I'd actually prefer a medical model to the model that's being adopted, which is a cult model in which science and medicine are being rejected. So in fact, I'm fearful that for kids with disabilities, the kids who have mental health conditions under the IDEA, if it's moved to HHS, would be at risk of even being recognized as having legitimate disorders.
And in that regard, the colloquy between Senator Tuberville and Secretary nominee Kennedy is instructive, where they were talking about how the medicine is not the right way to deal with ADHD. The right way is to beat the hell out of the kids.
Or put them on farms in Utah.
Well, yeah, and further to that point, many of the families boots on the ground. I know we have a lot of lawyers who are signed up for this, but there are also many parents who are signed up for this. Boots on the ground, we already face struggles around the IEP table or for 504 plans where school districts are trying to claim that children's conditions are medical and not their responsibility because it's not, this is not an educational impact, this is a medical impact. And I'm very fearful of it. And parents are stuck in the mode all of the time of their insurance companies saying this is not something we're going to cover because it's educational, and the school system saying this is not something we're going to address because it's medical. And I worry that if we move the IDEA functions over to the Health and Human Services, we're going to be stuck even more than we already are. So that's another concern.
I think what we really also got to focus on is whether OCR functions are moved or not. They have apparently fairly complete discretion to determine what to focus on. And they're focusing on the anti-woke agenda in terms of soliciting OCR complaints and not dealing with the rights of students.
One of the things I would add, just to add to the OCR, when you read Project 2025, which is the blueprint for everything that's being rolled out related to this, and the proposal is to move the Office for Civil Rights from the Department of Ed over into the Department of Justice. And there are even a couple of line items in there where they discuss that they would move away from any resolution agreements and only pursue anything that could be litigated. And when you think about what resolution agreements actually help us achieve in terms of schools agree to change their policies, schools agree to look at systemic issues, schools agree to provide training and TA to their districts are agreeing to this for their schools, and sometimes states are agreeing to this for all of their schools, districts and schools. So I think that's just another layer that's very worrisome in terms of the complaints might come in, but whether they would pursue what tiny percentage is very concerning.
Well, and one thing I do want to point out, the special education equity for kids of Connecticut, obviously, we are very fortunate in Connecticut in that we have a statute that largely mirrors the IDEA and are codified in our state regulations and our state law. But there are many states where there are no such protections. There are many states where students with disabilities and students who might have a 504 plan because they're transgender or for some other reason, where they don't have anything like a protection at the state level, let alone anyone enforcing it. And so that's another concern for people outside of Connecticut, that if we're really attacking any federal protections for these students, they're left in many states with no protection.
Unfortunately, we'd love the floor of what's provided and the floor of rights to be higher than it is, but it's quite clear that if the department is disbanded, there will essentially be no floor, and states will have great discretion and very little money in most states to invest in special education and the protections that go with it. So I think your point about variation is a very real one. The other thing that I think is a concern is that most states don't have the money to invest in research and in the development of best practices. We all have concerns about how the schools are educating on an ongoing basis and the need to improve the quality of education. And if all of those functions are moved to HHS and well, they've already cut $880 million in research and technical support. It's likely that that's going to be limited even further. And the result is going to be, it's going to be essentially the wild, wild west in terms of what schools do and what practices and curricula they adopt in order to provide services to their kids.
The other layer I'd like to add, because you've made so many great points, is, and I know Connecticut, you benefit from many of the programs that come through other laws that have been, and COPAA has had a hand in this directly in aligning education and workforce laws to ensure they support students and opportunities for students with disabilities to obtain career and technical education, to have vocational rehabilitation, which is authorized through the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, that's called WIOA. We've got language in the Higher Education Act around what personnel preparation should look like and other opportunities. And when you just lift IDEA out and move it over to HHS, what about all these other, most of this, I guess, would go over to Department of Labor and broken up into other pieces. What about that alignment that Congress has intentionally listened to our community, and we've had really great champions over the years to help align those laws so that not only requirements are aligned, but there's opportunity and funding to go with it. And I just, I don't want us to, I know we focus on IDEA and 504 because those are the core civil rights laws, but the educational opportunity is supported and comes through and is supported by these other laws as well.
Well, and some of those champions we've had in the past were Republicans. So Laura, you're working Capitol Hill all the time. When are some Republican senators going to stand up and say no?
It's an interesting question. I did want to tell you one of the clues we're going to have. So we have a one data point from a year and a half ago when the House took a vote whether to close the Department of Education, and 60 Republicans voted against that measure. Next week, there will be a hearing in the House Education and Workforce Committee chaired by the new chairman, Mr. Wahlberg from Michigan. Mr. Wahlberg is, I don't know what the right terminology now. I would say he's more of a moderate. I'm not even sure that's the right term these days, but he has been there a long time. If you remember John Klein, he's kind of John Klein-esque is how I would kind of describe him. He has spoken publicly about wanting to fully fund IDEA. I also know, and we work closely with his team on the committee because they have been retained from several years, including from Dr. Fox when she was the chairwoman, and 2 or 3 previous chairs, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. We have a lot of staff that stay on committee and we work with them. There will be a hearing next week on school choice, and it will be interesting to see what Mr. Wahlberg says in his opening statement, where he has said he wants to support the president's agenda. How far he will let them go in the House will be interesting, and we will be taking some cues from that next week. Andy and some of the COPA board members actually met with the staff I'm talking about, the Republican staff, when we went on Capitol Hill last May. And we asked point blank if some of these things would ever happen. Would we be eliminating the Department of Ed? Would we be block granting all of the Title I and the IDEA money? And at that point, they said they didn't think the House could tolerate those votes. We're, 9 months later, and a lot has happened in that time. So I will be reporting back after that hearing next week.
So that, I just wanted to say one thing, in terms of school choice for people, I think people don't realize how complex that issue is.
Yeah.
COPA, if I'm correct, has a paper on the impact of students with disabilities in terms of vouchers. And I think uniformly that impact is negative for children with disabilities.
Well, that was the question I was going to ask.
Yeah.
I'd like all of you to talk about the relationship between school choice and protection of the rights of kids with disabilities.
Do you have I don't remember if you have vouchers or education savings accounts in Connecticut? Because
We do not.
Nope. we
Okay.
don't.
So I'll go first,
did.
and then Matt, I know Matt's, he's an expert in this. So let me just go first from COPA's perspective. And that is, we understand many states have these programs, and some have been drafted specifically for children with disabilities and their families, and protect your access to your IDEA rights, to evaluations, to your services, even funding for transportation and things of that nature, to give you the option to move to a private or religious school should they admit your child, and your IDEA rights are maintained. Because of the complexities at the federal level that have something to do with called the Blaine Amendments, and we're not going to talk about that tonight, but it relates to the Blaine Amendments and an interpretation by the U.S. Department of Education that whenever a parent does accept or moves their child out of their public school, that's considered a private, you're parentally placing your child in the other school, which removes then the obligation of IDEA to go with your child. And to date, nobody on the Hill has been willing to help us think through a legal way to navigate that. So I'm going to stop there and say, so at this point, we say no to any voucher programs or vouchering or block granting of the money, which becomes a voucher, because the IDE rates do not go with it. And we want to be able to protect those funds in a way that would assure you can have adequate resources in your local schools without draining those monies away from local communities. So I'm going to stop there. We do have a whole page on this on the website and several things that you can read.
I think that there are consequences both for the individual family and child, and there are consequences for the kids who don't move out of the public school. But there's a fantasy about how vouchers will work that I think is born out of some parents are motivated by just preferring private schools. Some parents are motivated by a desire for religious education and other reasons. But the assumption is things will be better in the private school. And there are a whole lot of reasons to be concerned. What Laura said, questions about whether 504 applies, whether the ADA applies, if it's a religiously controlled school, and so on. And many reasons to be suspicious that many of the private schools will serve kids with disabilities at all, let alone well. There's a big issue about how they're policed and the concern about whether kids will be admitted. There's a lack of awareness that in order to avail yourself of the benefits of private schools, they have to be accessible in your community. And oftentimes the schools that might be capable of serving kids with disabilities may be far away from where the people live. And at the same time, all of these models take funding from the public schools in order to fund the vouchers for the private schools, leaving the public schools with the mandate to serve kids with disabilities with all the protections and less money. But the kids who have the most significant needs, in effect, stuck in the public school because the private schools won't accept them.
And the interesting fact is when Arizona expanded their voucher system to include everybody, it turned out that a substantial proportion of the recipients were people who already placed their kids in private schools and were just glad to get the $7,000 as a little supplement.
Right.
did not promote school choice in any way.
Right. And it's very similar you know, in the subtlety in some ways to what happens with magnet schools, right?
Yeah.
Magnet schools are publicly funded. Many of them discriminate against children with disabilities, even though they're not legally entitled to, either in the admissions process or by very quickly moving to expel them. And so we're going to probably see a very similar kind of thing happening if we were to move to that model, which we strongly are concerned about.
I have a regular parade in my office of families whose kid, and by the way, I should say, Illinois just revoked the voucher program, which I'm very proud of. But I have a parade of families in my practice, I'm sure you do as well, whose kids were in private school and they got into behavioral difficulty and the school just said, you're out.
Yeah.
And then the parents said, well, don't we have any rights? And what about IDEA and everything else? And the answer was, you might have some contract rights, but you probably don't have any other legal rights because you're particularly in a parochial school where ADA doesn't apply, you don't get federal funding and you're in trouble.
And doesn't the Florida voucher program explicitly say that you're waiving your IDEA rights? Yeah.
McKay does.
So, yeah. So
Let me ask this question, particularly of the two lawyers next to me. How much protection does the right to bring a due process action and to assert your right to an independent, impartial third party to a free appropriate public education, how much of a protection does that provide?
great deal. I mean, I believe if we look, none of us here are going to say two things. We're not going to say that there's no problems with bureaucracy, state, local, or federal. No way. We deal with it every day, and we know there's a lot of inefficiency. We're also not ever going to sit here and say that everything's perfect. But yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in on this question,
Well,
but
he takes a different view than yours. Than you.
Really, I would love to hear it.
Well, I think that the due process system in many places, including in Illinois where I am, and the judicial system is highly unreliable. The
Right.
only thing that's reliable is that it's going to be very time consuming and expensive, even if you have a pro bono lawyer. It's going to be time consuming and expensive for the family and for the lawyers prosecuting the case. The school districts have the advantage of control of much of the evidence and the burden of proof, and their legal fees are paid by district funds or insurance companies. That said, I would rather have the due process hearing as an available remedy than no remedy. And I'm able to settle a whole lot of cases because the school districts fear we're going to take them to due process, which would be much less likely if we had no mechanism like that.
I actually think
I
yeah.
just wanted to answer that as a parent. To me, that's the most important point right there, is that I've got a contract, right, with my IEP that says we agreed you're going to do X, and if you don't do it, then I have that option. If we don't have that, then they don't have to do anything, you know, I mean,
Well, as is, parents are acting as private attorneys general. Parents are enforcing this statute. That's what happens. In Connecticut, we constantly hear from various people at the State Department of Education that, oh, it's all these affluent Fairfield County parents who are hiring lawyers. If those families were not hiring lawyers, almost nobody would be holding them accountable, unfortunately. So it's already a humongous burden for families to overcome, even with the system we have in place. I agree with Matt, it's broken, but at least we have it. At least we can exercise parents' rights and assert some control over the situation that is usually out of control for most families.
And I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill explaining that it's still only 6 to 7% of all of the families nationwide that actually go all the way to that through that process. And we have a couple of states that are our highest, where, you know, the District of Columbia and New York continue to be the two states where they have the highest numbers, but there isn't this, not everybody's litigating. And that's something I have to spend time, because, you know, the superintendents and others would have everyone believe that all they're doing is chasing lawsuits.
Not true.
It might be true in a few places, but that is not true. And if they would just honor the IEP, they wouldn't have to worry about it at all.
Oh,
So-
but that's the-
Exactly.
But that's the point. You know, so many federal laws, so many federal and state laws are enforced by administrative agencies. And that, you know, in some cases, they're, you know, aggressive about it, but in a lot of cases, they're not aggressive at all about it. The right of a private action is terribly important. And it's, you know, it's what really sets the IDEA apart from a whole lot of other statutes.
It is.
You know, and back to the Department of Education, all of us have been disappointed at times by the lack of action by the Department of Education on some really solid complaints about failures of states and local districts to enforce the law. And the private right of action has been incredibly important. At the same time, it has also resulted in an incredibly inequitable system where the rich can occasionally get justice and the poor are left out in the cold.
Even in Connecticut, which has a very robust bar of parent attorneys, of the 250, 300 cases that get filed for due process every year, fewer than 10% go. I think it's less than 5% even. It's about 10.
We have
10 a year get fully
no
adjudicated.
4 last year.
4 last year. See,
Well, and I don't have actual data, but I have a strong feeling that the vast majority of cases that go to hearing involve therapeutic day school and residential placement, which are obviously very high ticket items on both sides. And there are a vast number of kids who are getting screwed in terms of their rights in the local school, in terms of least restrictive environment, in terms of procedural safeguards. And it's just not practicable to bring those cases to hearing in most cases for the family or lawyers, because the time and cost is enormous relative to what is the specific issue at hand.
Okay, so we've used up half our time. I want to come to the big question now. What can we do about this? What can the people watching do about this?
So the most important thing is if you have any Republican representatives in Connecticut, I'm trying to think.
Oh, we do not.
No. Okay,
do not.
well,
We're
Republicans are really important, but your whole delegations, all of the members need to know about your concerns. We have action alerts on COPAA's website. On the page under our work, it says under policy take action. We have alerts where you can go in and email, and it's important to remind Senator Murphy and others that you're paying attention, because he needs that data when he's going to meetings. And I know some of you got to meet with his staffer a few weeks ago, Peter Mills. They need to hear from you because it helps them do their work. All of those offices need to hear from you. The next thing is, I do think, and we're seeing even some of it play out right now, unfortunately, and the Democrats are basically telling us they want the lawsuits to move forward on the various issues that have happened. And it's an interesting tactic. Peter said it too, that a lot of this is going to end up in the courts. COPAA was successful. I don't get to decide what COPAA does in this area, making that very clear. Celine Almazan is the legal director, and she and a team of very bright people in COPAA make those decisions with partners. But I do know that in the lawsuit that proceeded around the equity and IDEA regulations, and COPAA successfully suing Betsy DeVos, the Department of Education, the secretary at that time, it has really helped. It's a litmus test now for what the department could or could not do in terms of following the law. They didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act. That's a big deal. And I'll be intrigued to see if they try and not follow that law again in terms of this dismantling. There are a lot of regulations. Thankfully, IDEA's regulations are codified with the statute for the most part, and most of them are. And so our regulations can't be stripped down. But like I said, all these other laws matter to us in some very distinct ways. And so we'll be watching that very closely.
further to Matt's point earlier, I think this is a separate point other than taking action individually. If we have a situation where our public schools have a lot less money, we already have understaffed schools, public schools, private schools are understaffed. We have many, many teachers who are wanting to leave the profession. And if you remove the supports that the U.S. Department of Education and IDEA and 504 offer for teachers as well, it's getting a lot worse. It's going to get a lot worse. And we already are seeing, I'm sure you're seeing it too. I have many clients who have IEPs where they are required to get a one-to-one paraprofessional. They're not. They're getting three children who are being assigned to the paraprofessional, even though that's a violation of their IEP. It's already pretty bad. And I think we could see a lot more teachers leave if we are in a situation where they have even less support than they do now.
So the question on the table was, what can parents do about that?
So I've got a
Contact
couple
their
ideas.
senators.
Well,
contact their-
I actually did a training on this topic a couple of days ago with 600 participants, parents and clinicians and educators. And interestingly, the first thing that I think is important, at the end of that training, there was a Q&A, and the last question that I got was, why are you fear-mongering? After a 2.5-hour training. And I bring this up because the very first thing that is important for people to recognize is this isn't like we're playing around. Bad stuff is already happening, and a whole lot more is likely to happen. So what we're already seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. And one of the things that parents need to do is to recognize this isn't like we can have wishful thinking and maybe it'll all go away. It's not going away. That's number one. Number two, and to Laura's point in the fact you don't have Republican legislators, frankly, the Democratic legislators are probably all going to vote no to the legislation we would want them to vote no to. But they're still setting priorities in terms of how they spend their time and invest their political capital. And we want them to be investing political capital in support of kids with disabilities. So they need to hear from this community too. And equally or more important, we all have relatives who are in other states and in other districts who may have Republican congresspeople or senators. And you need to let your family know that your kid is about to lose their services or something along that vein because of what's happening. And they need to be speaking up also. So even if you're in a state with essentially folks who are on our side, it doesn't mean you can't advocate with your greater circles of support to be making that point in other places.
Thanks, Matt. I think that's really important. And I would just add, I should have mentioned the very important need to tell Congress not to cut Medicaid. There are so many children and young adults who need Medicaid to either receive school-based services and or as part of their transition through vocational rehabilitation to become independent and adults. And those cuts to Medicaid that they're proposing are very real. And so I would just add that you can tell not only your members of Congress, but as Matt said, every person you know across the country to say no to those cuts to Medicaid, because it will hurt every person with a disability, all the way down to our youngest children that are born with disabilities and need services and supports.
Well, I want to take a little different approach. The legislative approach is not going to be effective in the short term. We know that. We've seen that already. That's no reason not to pursue it. It should be pursued. But we've got to find power in our powerlessness. We've got to find other ways to do it. I mean, in the message, if you read, Bob Caro on Johnson or on Moses, you don't create power through using time-worn traditional means. You find new ways to attack it. Demonstrations, letters to superintendents, letters to editors, standing up for your rights, a whole variety of different approaches. I think that the lobby Congress is fine and should be done, but there's a lot more and a lot different things and a lot more fun things that can be done to demonstrate these points. And that's what Matt and I are spending tomorrow doing.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And the other thing I would add to that, and by the way, I was responding to the question of what can we do to save the Department of Ed. But I think pushback in all areas is important, and every form of pushback counts cumulatively. Even if it doesn't have an impact immediately, the more pushback there is, the better. But the other thing I would just stress is keep in mind that DEI includes inclusion. Inclusion is also a very important issue in special education. And I mentioned that just to say that folks often don't think of DEI applying to the disability community, but it does. And it applies to actually everybody. And I say that to say that we also have to be careful in terms of thinking how we mobilize, the more we can mobilize with all of those other groups that are being affected, the more powerful we will all be, as opposed to saying, well, as long as we get our little piece, it's their problem if they don't get theirs. We have to recognize that a threat against somebody else's piece is also a threat against our piece.
And just a talking point that I know for those of you, because I agree completely with you, Matt, that talk to your family members, make them, if they don't live in Connecticut, make sure that they're taking action as well. A common thing that you'll hear is how expensive special education is, right? How often do we hear that every time the budget comes up in a municipality in Connecticut, the administration is blaming the costs of their budget on the special education students, pitting parents of children who do not have disabilities up against parents of children who do, because it's so costly, it's so expensive. Leaving aside that it's the law, and leaving aside that it's the right thing to do, it is actually the fiscally responsible thing to do. Because if we invest in children who might eventually become taxpayers, we're solving the concerns long term, not short term. And we see this, the outcomes for families who advocate for their children are so much dramatically better than those who don't. And we see that. And one of the things that SEEK is about is making sure that is trickling down to the students who do not have lawyers, who do not have advocates, who do not have somebody who can go into that IEP meeting and help them out. So this is really the right thing to do in every way. And so say that to your family members if they might be raising that issue with you.
So one thing that Peter Mills said that I want to repeat is that voluntary compliance is the road to fascism. And what we're seeing now is a whole bunch of our colleagues cowering, being afraid to talk DEI, being afraid to stand by their own, their beliefs, because they're afraid they're going to lose federal funding. And if that happens, those guys win. It's over. Game's over. We've got to get and our colleagues and school superintendents and school principals to resist. We've got to stand by them and push them to resist, because only in that way can we stop this trade.
And this may be a unique moment where there ought to be a high degree of confluence of interest between us and parties that we would normally regard as being on the other side. Special educators presumably want there to be good special ed programs. Administrators presumably want there to be quality schools. And frankly, their jobs may be at risk too if some of these changes happen. So the more that we can establish those collaborative efforts, the more power we'll have.
And Laura can talk about the groups we're working with in Washington, very much in that line, right?
Yes, in fact, I've had phone calls with the unions in the last 3 weeks trying to figure out if we could work together. It's an excellent point, and we all need to be thinking about what to protect and for what reasons to do that. I do want to say it is hard when we've had years of resistance to our policy asks from some of these groups. We've always held hands with all the groups on the money. We all do that together. Fully funding IDEA is actually a priority of the Council for Chief State School Officers. We work with them on that. We work with the unions. We work with the superintendents on the money. Everybody wants to discuss how to make sure there's more education money across the board. We get stuck a little when it comes to exclusionary discipline's a really good example. And I know we're not here to talk about that tonight, but it is an interesting time, and it is a unique moment, I think, for us to be thinking about what are those opportunities and how do we think about those. And Denise Marshall, the CEO of COPAA, is excellent at thinking about who our partners should be in what time and how to make that work in the best interest of the kids that COPAA represents and their families. So we're having those discussions.
Well, let's not leave exclusionary discipline to the side, because the folks on the other side are very clear that they believe in consequential discipline. They
Yep.
believe in corporal punishment. It is the case that maladaptive behavior goes with disability in many cases, and those are our kids who are going to be hurt, physically
Quite
hurt and
literally.
emotionally hurt by the sort of discipline policies that Senator Tuberville and Tucker Carlson have been promoting.
John, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, but if there are, I want to make sure that we give people an opportunity.
Yeah, I have been monitoring that, and thus far no one, and given our audience, I'm mostly shocked that some of those folks haven't interjected a question, but nothing thus far.
Well, having the bejesus scared out of you does make you quiet sometimes. So I'm not surprised, but maybe there'll be some questions now. But we need to keep in mind that, there is disability is part of the human condition, right? It has nothing to do with how you vote. It's just part of the human condition. We're here to just say, we're not trying to fearmonger. We wish we were wrong.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I would comment about that is that the more that you can make alliances, even in your own school district, the more that you'll be able to address some of these problems, because there are going to be issues at the local level, there are going to be issues at state level, and there obviously are issues we're talking about today at the federal level. And the more that you can take action at the state and local level to mobilize now, and in some respects inoculate your district, inoculate your state from some of the adverse effects that may come from changes at the federal level, you'll be proactive rather than reactive and more able to protect your kids.
Well, and moreover, the folks on the other side have a clear agenda. And, we want to make it as hard for, we don't have the power to stop them by a vote now, but we do have the power to make it really hard for them, to make it really unpleasant, to make them work really hard. And, if we stop them on early issues, they may not get to the more hard issues that we're really concerned about. And so I think that's so I think that the idea of sort of going along and waiting for the next big issue to fight is the wrong approach. I think the right approach is to fight right now.
I had a crisis of confidence sometime in my late 40s or early 50s when I felt that I was just basically spinning my wheels or tilting at windmills, Don Quixote. And I ultimately, that was actually a very depressing moment in my career. And I felt that, gee, the system isn't as good as we want it to be. It's not getting to be where we want it to be. And ultimately, I ended up deciding that every kid we help makes a difference individually, and every way that we push back, and this goes exactly to what Andy is saying, even if all we're doing is slowing down the bad efforts or holding the line, that's still positive. It's very important, because if we're not resisting, they're going to do even worse.
Yeah, I say this for any of you that have participated in the work that we do when you come on Capitol Hill with COPAA. I talk about that part of my job, and I think our role in COPAA, especially when it comes to folks that maybe even Republicans and even some of the Democrats who are wobbly, they're maybe they're up in their election cycle. They've got challenges that are hard for us to sort of consider when we believe we're right. But I think our role is to help our champions always do the right thing. That's absolutely a must. But we also have to help those who are willing to ensure we do no harm to IDEA. I do believe there are those members of Congress who do not want to do harm to IDEA because they understand at some level, whether it's political or not, they do not want to get, they don't want children with disabilities and those families to be able to go after them. And some of them do want to do the right thing. They just won't be public about it. So I believe that's part of our role is to help. I consider some good ones who will do and help them do no harm.
We
Well, I
we do have a question. Oh, go ahead, Andy.
No, well, I want to move towards, the last question. Go on with your question, then I'll pick this up, John.
What the question is if the Department of Ed is disbanded, what will happen to young adults in transition programs, the 18 to 22-year-olds?
That's a really good question. So that is a program that is authorized in Title IV of the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. That's where vocational rehabilitation is authorized. And I'm assuming they'll move it over to Department of Labor. Keep in mind, though, that dismantling the Department of Ed and all of its parts is going to require some action by Congress. And they really can't do it in one fell swoop because there are so many laws that live there. Now, what they can do and what they've started to do is they've started canceling contracts, canceling all of the discretionary funded programs that the secretary had authorized and, issued. And then some of these the categories of the budget that they don't view as they're thumbing their nose at appropriators. And so it's an interesting question, but we're trying to get a handle on how much they could do and how quickly they could do it. But Matt's right. It's happening. And we are trying to figure out to what extent could they actually do this and then just wait for the lawsuits. I don't know. You heard Secretary McMahon tell the Senate that she understood it would take action by Congress. And so there's some level of awareness they can't just do this.
Well, before I go on to my last pitch, tell us what we have to fear in the continuing resolution and in budget reconciliation in this regard.
Here's what you have to fear. So does everybody know what a continuing resolution is? That's in our...
Define it, please. Because
okay, so we're functioning every 12 months. Congress has to pass a new appropriations bill to fund the federal government bills. There are 12 bills. All of our funding sits in one big bill called the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education Related Agencies Bill, Labor H, we call it. That right now we're in fiscal year 25. It started last October 1. We are operating under a continuing resolution at fiscal year 24 levels. And so that was punted all the way until next week on the 14th is the deadline to make a decision about extending the continuing resolution to the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30, maybe another shorter time frame into the summer. That's highly unlikely, or to negotiate bills, which isn't happening. So they're trying to have this discussion. So here's what we have to fear. It's likely that there will be a continuing resolution, but there is another law called the Budget Control Act, which passed in 2023. So then President Biden and the House and the Senate agreed to a deal, and it had funding levels for 3 years in it, and fiscal year 25 is the last year of that deal. On April 30, the Budget Control Act kicks in, which means 70 billion needs to be cut from fiscal year 25 across the board, or however they want to do it, but they have to cut $70 billion out of fiscal year 24 levels. That's what we have to fear, Andy, is that $70 billion cut.
Okay, I want to move to our final takeaway always is we go around and ask people to give us something that gives them hope. And I want to talk about that for a moment. There's so many of my friends who have just shut off the television and think if they don't watch the news, it won't happen. That's not the case. That's not true. And there are also those who think that it's all hopeless, that we are utterly powerless. And we are fundamentally powerless, but we can find our own power in that powerlessness. And so it seems to me the single most important thing that we've got to have is hope that this is going to turn around. It may not turn around, in 2 years, it may not turn around in 4 years, but it is going to turn around. And if without that hope, we've lost. It's over. And so the question for each of you, and I'll start with Laura, is tell me something that gives you hope.
What gives me hope is that I fundamentally believe that there are good people in our US Congress. They may not be the ones that want to step up to the microphone and, talk about this or that. I fundamentally believe there are people that both want to help us and they do not want to hurt us. And so it's the combination of those folks that I'm trying to help COPA continue to not only meet with, but if we can't meet with them, they hear from us in some way or another. We're always working to prevent that someone can't say, well, we never heard from them about this. We want to make sure our voice is heard. And so I believe in the power of our voice. That gives me hope. It always has. And I also believe COPA is uniquely positioned because of the power of our advocacy and our legal prowess. Those two things, and just the power of our community, all three together, uh, help us to lead the disability community in education policy and also to inspire folks to want to sit next to us and work with us. And so that's what gives me hope.
Matt, what gives you hope?
Not sure I see quite as much optimism as you described in relation to hope, but I am hopeful based on seeing many, many people engaging in many different ways to find channels to push. And I think it's important to value whatever a person does to push and continue to fight. The other thing I would say that's not exactly related to hope, because I frankly, a lot of this is very depressing. And even though we need hope, we also need to recognize it's pretty depressing and upsetting. We're all quite unhappy about it. And Laura used the word community. Find community and find solace and be not obsessed about the things we're worried about, but able to talk about them, to share concerns and comfort each other and get strength from each other. All of us will be able to find hope more to the extent that we're doing it with others rather than on our own.
Gosh, what gives me hope? Well, COPA gives me hope. I'll say that for sure. COPA gives me a lot of hope. I get to this conference every year, about ready to open a flower shop. So this is definitely an organization like Seek that gives me hope. I also am hopeful because most people are touched by disability in some way. And most people know that what families endure when they have children with disabilities, even when we have a robust protection, is a lot, and are sympathetic, and I think will stand up when time comes to protect the people they know and love. I believe that.
Well, let
Okay,
me throw in I've been quiet. Let me throw in my 2 cents. I see hope that our community is working. In Connecticut, we had a potential change in eligibility for special education, particularly for kids in transition. When we put out an alert, we had a very, very substantial response of parents reaching out to our legislature to tell them that that's not a thing to do. Also, our legislature passed $40 million to help cover the cost of high-cost students. Our governor vetoed it. And we have found a way to come to a plan to get that money back out to our kids, so that it is not only coming out, but it's coming out to the schools a month sooner than expected. So the fact is that there are people out there that are doing the right thing, given the opportunity to do so, and that there are families out there who are going to work their tails off to make all this work. And thank you.
so I'll get the last word here. I'm taking a more,
Shocker. You want the last word?
I'm
No
taking
way.
a more global view. In my view of history, dictators need a certain quantum of public support to maintain their power. These guys are so overreaching that I don't think they're going to have that. And I think this is all going to come collapsing down sooner rather than later. And it's for that hope that I get up every morning and keep up the fight.
Hope you're right.
With that from your lips, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you so much to our panel for your tremendous insight and support. And thank you for the members and board members of SEEK who make all of this possible. You all have a great evening. Enjoy the conference.
Thanks. Sign off now.